أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Let me begin by thanking the moderator for making a very good introduction to the lecture, and I believe he has stated the reasons why we initiated the Sokoto Caliphate lecture series. We need to educate the world about the legacies of the Sokoto Caliphate leaders, the intellectual legacies of the Sokoto Jihad leaders. But much more importantly, we need to educate our younger ones who know next to nothing about the history of the Sokoto Jihad, the history of the Sokoto Caliphate, and the relevance of that history to our present circumstances and contemporary situation. So I don't have to take much time on that. And it has also been stated that this is the third lecture in the series, and there will be about 5 more lectures, inshallah, on the Sokoto Caliphate lecture series. The topic of my presentation, as stated by the moderator, is leadership values and good governance in the perspective of the Sokoto Caliphate triumvirates. This word triumvirates means the 3 leaders, the 3 intellectual leaders of the Sokoto Jihad or of the Sokoto Caliphate, meaning Sheikh Usman bin Fodio rahimahullah, Sheikh Abdullahi bin Fodio rahimahullah, and Sultan Muhammad Bello rahimahullah. Now, the outline of my presentation on this topic will be as follows. The first thing I will discuss is the importance of leadership and the significance of political authority in Islam. Then I will discuss the crisis of leadership and the quest for responsible leadership and good governance. The next thing is an attempt to define good governance both from the from the conventional perspective and the Islamic perspective. Then I will discuss the Sokoto Jihad leaders. I will give a general resume, just a brief one, about the biography of the Sokoto Jihad leaders. Then this will be followed by a general overview of the writings of the Sokoto Jihad leaders on leadership, politics, social justice, and good governance. The next thing will be discussion of specific perspectives of the Sokoto Jihad leaders on leadership and good governance. And then the next thing, or the final thing, will be conclusion and recommendations. Now, talking about the importance of leadership in Islam and the significance of political authority, we wouldn't have to take long time discussing this. In an hadith that is reported by Abu Dawud, the Prophet ﷺ demonstrates to us the importance of leadership when he says that when 3 persons are going to travel, they must appoint one of them to lead them, that is, to be their leader. Now, on the basis of this and many other sources of Sharia, Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio in Diya'ul Hukam says, let it be known that appointing a leader is obligatory upon Muslims based on sources of Sharia and also the ijma of Muslim scholars, that it is an ijma. There is a consensus among Muslim scholars that appointing leaders is obligatory. Muslims cannot stay without leadership. It will be an abomination that a society or community stays without leadership. Other scholars that affirm this position include Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, when he says that there is an ijma, there is a consensus among all Muslim scholars, among the Sunni, the Shia, the Murji'ah and the Khawarij, that there is a consensus across all these groups that appointing a leader is obligatory. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah made the same assertion. Ibn Khaldun in Muqaddimah also made the same assertion. Now, it is instructive to note that even in animal communities, there is leadership. There is hierarchy of leadership. There is distribution of roles and distribution of duties and responsibilities even among animal communities. The Quran has affirmed that. The Quran has told that there is leadership among animal communities. In the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam in Surah An-Naml, Allah tells us the command that was given by the queen ant to her fellow queen that they should all retire to their halls lest they be smashed by Sulaiman and his horse. Ya ayyuhan lam nudkhulu masakinakum la yahtimannakum Sulaiman wa junuduhu wa hum la yash'urun. In Islam, all the five pillars of Islam are governed by leadership, and they are being carried out through leadership. They are being executed through leadership. Kalimatu Shahada, for example, if a person wants to convert to Islam, he must declare Kalimatu Shahada before a Muslim leader. And then Salat cannot be performed in congregation without leadership. Zakat can only be executed with leadership. The same thing about fasting. A leader has to declare that fasting should begin and fasting should end when the month of Shawwal is sighted. And so also about Hajj. None of the Islamic pillars can be executed or can be observed or conducted or carried out without leadership. This reminds me about a wise saying of one of the pre-Islamic poets of Al-Afwa Al-Awadi, when he says, La yasluhun nasu fawda la surata lahum wa la surata lahum idha juhaluhum sadu. That people's affairs will never be good without an organized leadership. So leadership is necessary in human communities, but even much more necessary in Islamic communities. What about the essence of leadership and the significance of political authority in Islam? The Quran has told us about the essence of leadership and the significance of political authority. In Surah Al-Hajj, verse 41, that is chapter 22, verse 41, where Allah says, الَّذِينَ إِمَّكَّنَّاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ أَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتَوُوا الزَّكَاةَ وَأَمَرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهَوْا عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَلِلَّهِ عَاقِبَةُ الْأُمُورِ. Those Muslim rulers who, if we give them power in the land, they enjoin compulsory observance of regular prayers, the payment of zakat, and they enjoin goodness and righteousness, al-ma'ruf and al-munkar. They forbid evil, that is munkar, and with Allah rests the end of all affairs. So in Islam, leadership is about establishing the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth, establishing morality and moral uprightness on earth, enforcing moral uprightness on earth, and establishing justice, as it is also indicated in Surah Sad, in the story of Dawood alayhi salam, where Allah says, يا داود إنا جعلناك خليفة في الأرض فاحكم بين الناس بالحق ولا تتبع الهوى أن فيضلك عن سبيل الله إن الذين يضلون عن سبيل الله لهم عذاب أليم شديد بما نسوا يوم الحساب. So the essence of leadership in Islam and the significance of political authority in Islam is about establishing the worship of Allah, establishing justice and fairness on earth, and enforcing morality on earth. It is instructive to note that both Shehu Usman dan Fodio and Abdullah ibn Fodio in Diya'ul Siyasat and in Diya'ul Hukam respectively. That is to say, Sheikh Usman dan Fodio in Diya'ul Siyasat, Sheikh Abdullah dan Fodio in Diya'ul Hukam mentioned this duty about enforcing the laws of Allah, establishing justice and prohibiting evil as the cornerstone of leadership, the primary essence and significance of leadership in Islam. Now, what is it that motivated us to discuss about leadership in the perspective, leadership values and good governance in the perspective of the Sokoto Jihad leaders? What actually motivated us is that there is actually a crisis of leadership. Like the moderator started saying, there is crisis of leadership, and hence the quest for good governance is becoming more and more momentous, ubiquitous. So there is crisis of leadership. But I want to look at this crisis of leadership from two dimensions. In the first dimension, I am worried about the leadership crisis within Muslim societies, within Muslim organizations, and within Muslim communities. What characterizes the problem of leadership in many Muslim organizations and Muslim communities is incompetence, ineptitude, and naivety in leadership, lack of proactiveness and tactfulness in leadership, insensitivity and lack of responsiveness in leadership, lack of vision, lack of sense of mission, and there is usually no planning, no strategic thinking among many Muslim leaders in Muslim organizations, in Muslim communities, and in Muslim societies, and even at global level. You can see Muslim countries are the most challenged in terms of the issue of leadership. Unfortunately, many Muslim countries today are in disarray. Many Muslim communities are so destabilized because of the crisis of leadership. Now, when you look at it from the perspective of our national living, that is in the Nigerian perspective, leadership crisis has become so endemic that ordinary Nigerian today loses hope about the possibility of getting responsible leadership. Unfortunately, we can see the monumental corruption that is taking place even in the present dispensation. Look at the monumental corruption that is taking place. Impunity has come to gain ground in Nigeria. Like somebody says, corruption and poor leadership have become our own weapon of mass destruction. We are living in a condition of war in this country. Even countries that are in war, their conditions cannot be as worse as our own condition in this country because of poor leadership. So there is real crisis of leadership in our country. But even globally, you can see that there is crisis of leadership in many countries. People are yearning for responsible leadership. People are yearning for, good governance in all parts of the world. This is attested to by many scholars and by many organizations. For example, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific asserted that recently the terms governance and good governance are gaining ground, are increasingly being used in development literature, because bad governance is being increasingly regarded as one of the root causes of all evil within our societies. Bad governance is responsible for, poverty. Bad governance is responsible for, all sort of impunity that is going on in many countries, but most especially in our own country. Bad and poor schools, very poor healthcare delivery system, very filthy environment, diseases, and all sort of, very terrible conditions in our own society, in our country. So there is real crisis of leadership. Now, this brings us, to further assertion that is made about this issue. When Hassan and Young stated that issues of good governance are being widely discussed and debated all over the world today, there is today a flurry of activity to better understand not only the social, economic, and political imperatives that underpin the nature and purpose of good governance, but also to appreciate the cultural sources and traditions which have contributed to and influenced the way we govern societies and manage our own business enterprises. This underscores the need for us to look at or to look into the intellectual heritage of the Sokoto Caliphate on issues of leadership values and issues of good governance. Now, the importance of good governance is further, emphasized by the late Kofi Annan when he says good governance is perhaps the single most important factor in eradicating poverty and promoting development in the world today. Now, having discussed this, we now move to define leadership and good governance. I wouldn't take time in defining leadership. Many of us know the definition of leadership. But what about good governance? The term good governance, as has been asserted by many scholars, is actually a new term. I can even say that when I was a university student over 30 years ago, I can hardly remember mention of the word good governance. This is a new coinage, good governance. Many scholars have stated that it was first, coined by the World Bank and several other development literature. So it's a very recent term. But whatever the case may be, we need to understand it and we need to define it from conventional and from Islamic perspective. In this regard, let me first of all define it from the conventional perspective. Then I will come to see the definition from the Islamic perspective. Good governance, as defined by UNESCO, that is United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. It says good governance is participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and follows the rule of law. It assures that corruption is minimized and that the views of minorities are taken into account and that the voices of the most vulnerable in society are heard in decision making. It is also responsive to the present and future needs of society. This is the definition given by UNESCO. UNDP identified 9 characteristics of the definition of good governance, which are almost the same with the one that I have just read. These 9 characteristics include: number 1, participation, observance of rule of law, transparency, responsiveness in leadership, consensus orientation, equity, effectiveness and efficiency, accountability, and strategic vision. This is the definition given from the conventional perspective, and as you can see, this definition is secular. What about the definition of good governance from the Islamic perspective? The concept that is closest to to good governance in Islam, the concept that is very close to it is the concept of siyasa shar'iyya, as-siyasa ash-shar'iyya, siyasa to shar'iyya. Sheikh Usman Danfodio talked about siyasa to shar'iyya in his book Diya'us Siyasat. We will come to refer to it more copiously. Again, we would remember the book by Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, As-Siyasatu Shar'iyya fi Islahi Ra'i wa Ra'iyya. So when we come to look at good governance from the Islamic perspective, one would say from the perspective of Siyasa Shar'iyya, if we know the definition of Siyasa Shar'iyya, but we will come to discuss it further, we would say that all the 9 characteristics of good governance as identified and enumerated by UNDP, all these are inclusive in the Islamic definition of good governance or in the concept of Siyasa al-Shar'iyya. They are all inclusive. But then, the definition of good governance or Siyasa Shar'iyya in Islam does not stop at these 9 points enumerated by UNDP or these things identified by UNESCO. Like I said, they are all included in the Islamic concept of Siyasa Shar'iyya. But however, the definition of good governance in Islam goes beyond these ones to include necessarily not a matter of not a matter of choice, but a matter of necessity. The definition of good governance in Islam must include al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahyu anil munkar. That governance must also include enjoining and enforcing righteousness, enjoining and enforcing morality, and prohibiting evil, prohibiting munkarat, all sorts of evils, all sorts of forbidden abominations, al-fahsha, al-fawahish, and haram must all be enforced. This is a necessary thing in the Islamic definition of good governance. As we read in the verse earlier, we read from Surah Al-Hajj, الَّذِينَ إِن مَكَّنَّاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ أَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتَوُوا الزَّكَاةَ وَأَمَرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهَوْا عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ. So, good governance in Islam must necessarily include establishing the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the essence of leadership in Islam. Leadership in Islam will be useless if salat will not be observed regularly. Leadership in Islam will be useless if zakat will not be observed. Leadership in Islam will be useless if zina and all sorts of abominations are allowed to spread in the land. If alcohol will be consumed freely, all these are, munkarat. So in Islam, good governance, in addition to all those things that are just mundane, good governance in Islam include al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahyu anil munkar wa iqamati salah wa ita'i zakah, as the case is always, inshallah. Now, having given this definition of good governance, now let us talk about the Sokoto Jihad leaders or the Sokoto Caliphate leaders in brief. I'm not going to talk about when Sheikh Usman Danfodio was born, how he started his education, this and that. I'm not going to go into those details. I will just say one thing. I will just say one thing, which was an assertion that was made by one of the renowned scholars of Sokoto Caliphate, that is Professor Mare Last. Professor Mare Last says the Sokoto Jihad was a revolution of the young. A revolution of the young. And we will just tell us about the Sokoto Jihad leaders from the perspective of this statement or assertion made by Mare Last. When he says revolution of the young, what does he mean? He means that the Sokoto Caliphate leaders or the Sokoto Jihad leaders and Caliphate leaders were very young people. Even at the point when the Sokoto Caliphate was established, these people were very young. When we talk about Sheikh Usman Danfodio, people might think that we are talking of people that are in their 60s or in their 70s. But these were young people. Sheikh Usman Danfodio was born in 1754 and he began preaching in 1774. You can see that he began teaching and preaching at the age of 20. He just began the movement at the age of 20. Sheikh Abdullahi Danfodio was 12 years younger than Sheikh Usman Danfodio. So he was very young. But then, what is even more instructive is that at the time when Sultan Muhammad Bello, that is when eventually the Caliphate was established, at the time when Sultan Muhammad Bello became the Amirul Mu'minin and the Sultan, he was just above 30 years. He was only above 30 years when he became the Amirul Mu'minin. And Sheikh Usman Danfodio, when the Caliphate came into reality, he was just around 50 years old. You can see they were young people that actually established the Sokoto Caliphate. If there is any lesson in this, especially for our young ones, is that this should inspire us. Those of our young ones, this should inspire us. The most amazing thing is that while these people were young, look at it. They were teaching, they were preaching, they eventually embarked on jihad. Then eventually the Caliphate was established. They embarked on statecraft and administration. But in spite of all this, and in spite of the young age, look at the knowledge they amass. Look at the books they wrote. The Arabic they write, and the Arabic the Arabic they wrote and the Arabic they spoke is superb. You can imagine if they went to any Arab country to study, but they all studied here. But they write Arabic without any blemish. This should inspire the young ones among us. Having said this, let us look at now, let us go into the real discussion about their perspectives on leadership and on good governance. First, we begin with a general overview of the writings of Sokoto Jihad leaders on leadership, politics, social justice, and good governance. In the first instance, we need to make the point that Sheikh Usman Danfodio was out for a general reform, a general religious reform. He came out to reform the religion generally and to revive it as it was being practiced in Hausa land. So the main thrust of the Sheikh's teaching, preaching, and writings were first and foremost the issue of the purification of religious creed, that is Aqidah, and purification of worship, that is Ibadat, from polytheism, that is from Shirk, and from idiosyncrasies, that is Khurafat, and Bid'ah, innovations, and also teaching people about moral uprightness and the purification of the soul, that is akhlaq and tasawwuf. Now these are very common themes in the writings of Sheikh Usman Danfodio. For example, in Nurul Albab, in Wathiqatul Ikhwan, in Sirajul Ikhwan, in Ihya'us Sunnah wa Ikhmadul Bid'ah, in many other books. You can see all these issues of general religious reform, reform of Aqidah, reform of Ibadah, reform of Akhlaq, from all sorts of shirk and idiosyncrasies. This is from a general perspective. In other words, I'm trying to say that they didn't come out just for the purpose of political reform. It was a comprehensive religious and socio-political reform. And this can be seen also when we come to discuss about their writings on socio-political reform. That is to say, besides the general perspective, let us now focus on socio-political reform as part and parcel of the overall jihad, the revolution that they embarked upon. Sheikh Usman Danfodio, tells us about their aim at political or socio-political reform, especially in one of his books on political reform, that is Kitabul Farq. For example, Sheikh Usman Danfodio in this book describes leadership, what he calls leadership of the infidels. Leadership of the infidels, that is leadership of people that don't believe in God, whether religiously permitted or forbidden, and drinking whatever beverages they wish, whether religiously permitted or forbidden, and riding whatever riding beast they wish, whether religiously permitted or forbidden, and taking whatever women they wish without marriage, whether religiously permitted or forbidden, and spreading soft decorated carpets as they wish, whether religiously permitted or forbidden. You can see the kind of, mission that Sheikh Usman Danfodio came out with in terms of political reform. Now this is about fighting corruption in leadership, fighting fraud in leadership, looting from the public treasury. This is further enunciated in many other writings of Sheikh Usman Danfodio. Now, some of the famous writings of the jihad leaders on socio-political reform, there are many, they wrote many on socio-political reform, but some of the famous ones that are presented here, but not chronologically, include, for example, Kitab al-Farq, part of which we just read. Kitab al-Farq by Sheikh Usman Danfodio. Al-Masail al-Muhimma, also by Sheikh Usman Danfodio. Diya us-Siyasat by Sheikh Usman Danfodio. And then there is, for example, Bayan Wujub al-Hijra by Sheikh Usman Danfodio. There is Usul al-Adl, also by Sheikh Usman Danfodio. When we come to Abdullah Danfodio, we will see that he wrote more than the rest on issues of governance, leadership, and statecraft. One of the most famous of his writings on this is Diya ul-Hukam, Fima lahum wa alayhim min al-Ahkam. There is Diya ul amri wal mujahidin, Fi siratin nabi wal khulafa'ir rashidin. There is Diya ul-Umara. There is Diya ul-Sultan, and so on and so forth. Sultan Muhammad Bello also wrote a number of books on socio-political reform, leadership values, and governance. For example, the famous among them is his magnum opus, that is Usul al-Siyasat. And then there is Al-Ghais al-Wabl Fi Sirat al-Imam al-Adil. There is Al-Ghais al-Shu'bub Fi Tawsiyati Amir Yaqub, and so on and so forth. Infaq al-Maysur can also be considered as one of the books that Sultan Muhammad Bello wrote on issues of governance and leadership. Now this is from a general perspective. Let us look at their perspectives on leadership from very specific points of views. Now, on the issue of good governance, as they all stated that good governance is the essence of politics in Islam. Sheikh Usman Danfodio made it very clear that good governance is the essence of politics in Islam. What he is saying, and I will read, but before I read, what Sheikh Usman Danfodio is saying is that if a Muslim would participate in politics, then it must necessarily be for the purpose of engendering good governance. If as long as you will participate in politics not for the purpose of engendering good governance, Sheikh Usman Danfodio said it is clearly and categorically haram to participate in politics. But he says that for the sake of enforcing good governance and engendering good governance and responsible leadership, participating in politics is obligatory. He says in Diya us-Siyasat that siyasa is of two categories. There is what he calls siyasa adila and siyasa zalima. Siyasa adila and siyasa zalima. What is siyasa adila? He says siyasa adila, that is just and legitimate politics is the politics that procures people's right from the unjust and from the wicked. It is the politics that also sanctions and reprimands the perpetrators of corruption and evil. This is siyasa adila. And he says it is obligatory. I mean, about the latter, about siyasa zalima, he says it is the siyasa that perpetrates corruption. It is the siyasa that perpetrates zulm, injustice and tyranny in the society. It is the siyasa that doesn't procure the rights of the weak from the wicked ones. And he says it is obligatory to participate in siyasa adila, that is siyasa that is based on bringing good governance, siyasa whose intention is about engendering responsible leadership and good governance. He says it is obligatory for people to participate in siyasa adila. What are the reasons of Sheikh Usman Danfodio? He says the reason is that if people that are good refuse to participate in siyasa adila, then it means that will result in the neglect of people's right, in abandoning of Sharia laws, and in the emboldening of the corrupt miscreants in the society, as we are seeing today. And it will also open the door of wrongdoing and injustice, bloodshed, and acquisition of wealth unlawfully, if people refuse to participate in siyasa adila. And as I said earlier, he says categorically, for these reasons, participating in siyasa adila is compulsory, is obligatory. And for the same reason, participating in siyasa zalima is haram. That is to say, if a person will participate in politics only to go and promote corruption, only to be partaking in fraud, then it is haram. He should know that he is just dining, eating and clothing himself in haram. This is very clear as far as Sheikh Usman Danfodio is concerned. Then, number two, another important thing is Sharia guided politics is an obligation. I think I have made this point. That is to say, Sharia, siyasa adila, which is siyasa sharia, Sheikh Usman Danfodio said it is obligatory. Now, coming to issues of social justice, both Sheikh Usman Danfodio and Abdullah ibn Fodio have stated that social justice is the essence of leadership and is indeed the foundation of leadership. For example, in Diya'us Sultan by Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio, he says this is obligatory, that the leader must ensure justice, and that means to give every owner of right, of any kind of right, his or her own right duly, regardless of whether it is from oneself. That is, even if the right were from the leader, then the leader must ensure that he give that right to whom it is due. That is Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio's definition of justice. He said it makes no difference whether that particular right supposed to be procured were upon the leader himself or upon someone who is close to the leader or among the subjects. The leader must ensure that people's rights are procured and people's rights are given duly. Leadership will be useless if people will not get their own rights, if people's rights will not be protected. Especially, the most important right is the right to living and the right to own property. If people will just be killed indiscriminately, if people's life will be unworthy of protection by the state, leadership will be useless. So I think this is very important to emphasize, especially in our present situation in Nigeria, where killings are just going on, unfortunately, on a daily basis. On a daily basis, not in single digits, not only in double digits, but sometimes killings are going on in triple digits. Hundreds of people will just be killed at once. So unfortunate. There were times even the killings took place in 4 digits. Thousands of people, like the killing that happened in Baga, where over 2,000 people were killed just at a go. And today people are just continuously being killed. So the leader must protect people's right. And this is the essence of leadership as far as Sheikh Abdullah Fodio is concerned in Diya'u as-Sultan. What about equality before the law? It is instructive to note that in his Usulul Adl, while enumerating the principles of justice, Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio mentioned as the 5th principle that the leader should consider and always see himself as part of and equal to the subjects in respect of all issues, in respect of all complaints, and in respect of all problems presented before him. He should see himself as equal to all subjects. Everybody should be equal before the law. A practical illustration of this equality before the law was given by Sheikh Abdullah bin Fodio in Diya'ul Hukam, when he says, in a very practical illustration, he says, it is in the interest of justice to treat equally any 2 disputants with regard to their entry into his presence. When 2 people that are disputing are coming to you as a leader or as a judge, for example, as they are coming to you, Sheikh Abdullah Fodio said it's necessary to treat them in the way you even receive them, in terms of the way they sit, in terms of the way he looks at them, how he addresses them in all matters connected with them, without showing favor to either of them. Whoever greets him between the 2, he should not return the greeting with an excessive mood of cheerfulness, nor kindness, and must not talk much to him. That is to say, maybe this one is closer to you in a way. They greeted you, and then you begin to ask the other person, how about your children? Iyali, how is the family? Because this one, you don't know him, you may not ask him those questions. He says, when they come to you as a leader and there are 2 disputants, you are to judge between them. You must not even show excessive mood of cheerfulness to one of them more than the other. You shouldn't show kindness to one of them more than the other. You should not even talk to one of them more than you talk to the other. Even the way you look at them, meaning that you should not be looking pointedly at one while neglecting the other. This is a practical illustration of equality before the law in a very minute sense, as depicted by Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio in Diya'ul Hukam. Now, coming to the issue of, this is what we have just discussed is about the issue of supremacy of the rule of law, equality before the law, right to fair hearing. That is issues about retributive justice. Then coming to the issues of distributive justice in leadership, that is the principle of equal opportunities, equitable distribution of wealth, and equitable distribution of opportunities. People in the society, in the country, must have equal access to opportunities. Opportunities should not be, shared unequally, just as wealth should not be shared unequally. Like Allah says, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْهُمْ. In Diya'ul Umara, for example, Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio dedicated a whole section of a chapter on what he calls Masariful Amwal. Masariful Amwal. How wealth should be distributed in a nation, or in a country, or in a society, or in a community. He says in this section Sheikh Abdullah, he concisely discussed the distribution of zakat al-fitr, the general zakat, distribution of zakat, and he talks about the distribution of the wealth in public treasury, that is Baytul Mal. Then coming to another issue that is very important in leadership is the issue of transparency and accountability in public responsibility and leadership. First, beginning with looting from the public treasury and breaching of trust. In Diya'ul Umara, Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio dedicated a whole section or chapter to this, and he captioned it Fasl al-Fasl فيما لا يحل للأمراء أخذه من الأموال ما لا يحل للأمراء أخذه من الأموال. That is a chapter that explains that which is not permissible for leaders to take of public wealth. He discussed extensively about the prohibition of taking anything from public treasury based on nusus. And we can recall the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he says, whoever is assigned to any public responsibility and some allowance or salary is, stipulated for him or her, and he takes a needle or anything above it, shall come with it on the day of judgment. In Diya'ul Hukam, Sheikh Abdullah Fodio charges leaders on the need to enforce asset declaration and regular auditing of their appointees. That whenever they appoint leaders, that is, they appoint governors, or they appoint ministers, or they appoint chairmen, as the case may be, or they appoint, they delegate responsibility. He says that it is important that they should make them to declare their asset at the point of appointment. And he says after some time, he should be undertaking regular auditing. He should be undertaking regular auditing of their, possessions. And he says, whatever is found of their wealth, which cannot be explained, which cannot be proven to be legitimate earning from their allowances or their salary, he says this should be confiscated and taken back to the public treasury. Whenever an regular auditing is undertaken, that is to say, not in the way we do it now, that when an appointee or an electee is finishing his term or her term, then it is at that point that he will now declare asset for the second time, after declaring for the first time on appointment. So you can see Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio is saying that it should be conducted, auditing should be conducted on a regular basis to see whether they have accumulated wealth illegitimately. And whatever is got is seen to be illegitimately acquired should be confiscated by the leader. What about taking bribe or any form of gratification in leadership? Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio again gave very clear and unambiguous ruling on this in Diya'us Sultan wa ghayrihi min al-ikhwan. He says, of the kinds of wealth that are made unlawful by Allah to the umara wa ghayrihim, that is wa ghayrihim meaning rulers and others meaning their subordinates, their employees, their delegates, isn't it, whom they delegate a responsibility. He said of the wealth that is prohibited for them is all those are obtained through zulm, injustice and oppressive exploitation. And one type of zulm, he says, is ar-risha. Ar-risha, bribes given to them, given to the sultan, that is to the president or to the governor, or something from one of two disputants or from both of them before rendering justice or even after it. or even after it. So even after judgment, the qadi or the leader should not take anything from any two disputants. And similarly, acceptance of ordinary gifts by the sultan from subjects or citizens is the gate of all evils. If a leader will accept gifts from his subjects, so, Sheikh Abdullah Fodio in Dia Sultan says that is the gate of all evils. That is to say, even not at the point of Sharia, of litigation, whatever the case may be, even not at that point, just ordinarily, for the leader or Al-Qali, for example, to be accepting gifts from his subjects, that is the gate of all evil, in the sense that when any situation happens and they are arraigned before you, the person that regularly gives you gifts and you collect, you may not be able to be fair. That is what Sheikh Abdullah ibn Fodio means. He says, once gifts find inroads to a ruler or leader, justice and equity and righteousness instantly get compromised. They instantly get they are instantly stripped up from him. Now, another issue is delegation of authority based on merit and supervision as cornerstones of leadership and good governance. That is to say, assigning responsibilities and delegating authorities on the basis of trust and on the basis of merit. This is one essential cornerstone of leadership, responsible leadership and good governance. Respect for merit, respect for competence in assigning responsibilities and in delegating authority. The Sokoto Jihad leaders are telling us that this is a cornerstone in leadership. And let me make this point. Many of us are fond of quoting a statement from Sheikh Usman Fodio that a nation can survive kufr but cannot survive injustice. Of course, this statement is not only attributable to Sheikh Usman Fodio but also attributable to many scholars that have written on leadership. It's usually attributable also to Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. But the point I want to make is that many of us made this statement. Little did we do we know that that particular statement is specifically, related to this issue of assigning responsibilities based on merit and competence. That is to say, when people are assigned responsibilities and they are delegated some form of state function or state duty, not based on competence and merit, it is at that level that that nation cannot survive that kind of injustice. This is very clear in the explanation made by Sheikh Usman Fodio in Bayan Wujub al-Hijrah. Sheikh Usman Fodio in Bayan Wujub al-Hijrah says, a man was asked why the rule of the Sassanid dynasty had degenerated to the extent it had. He said that was because they had appointed low men to high posts. When lowly people are appointed to hold very high public offices that they don't deserve, then that is the kind of injustice that nations will never survive. This is the interpretation of the verse in Surah An-Nisa, which Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah took time to discuss in Siyasatu Shari'iyah. Inna Allah ya'murukum an tu'addul amanati ila ahliha. This amanat, which is the one referred to by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the hadith, in which he was asked, when will the hour strike? Mata sa'a ya Rasulallah? Qala idha duyi'atul amana. When amana is betrayed. Wa kayfa ida'atuha? How will amana be betrayed, ya Rasulallah? He said, tawsidul amri ila ghayri ahlihi when people that do not deserve responsibilities are assigned, when incompetent people are assigned to hold on certain positions in public responsibility, this is ida'atul amana, and it is the injustice that nations will never survive. One of the swiftest ways, Sheikh Usman Amfodio in Bayan Wujubil Hijrah says, one of the swiftest ways of destroying a kingdom is to give preference to one particular tribe over another, or to show favor to one group of people rather than another, and draw near those who should be kept away, and keep away those who should be brought near. A king was asked after he had lost his throne, "What brought your rule to an end?" The king replied, he said, "Being intransigent in my views and neglecting to seek advice." So, consultation, seeking advice, and assigning people based on competence and merit to responsibilities is a cornerstone in leadership. I can see that I have taken quite a long time, and I know there are people who will ask questions and make comments. So I will have to stop here, not because I have exhausted the discussion on the leadership values and governance, good governance, which they have discussed in many of their books, but I have to stop here. But let me say that if we need for additional knowledge on this subject matter, we may need to refer to Dr. Mahmoud Tukur, Leadership, the Relevance of Values. It was his PhD thesis, which was published as a book with this title, and it was essentially on leadership values as enunciated by the Sokoto Caliphate. Another important reading is the book written by Dr. Hamid Boboyi, which is Principles of Leadership, according to the founding fathers of the Sokoto Caliphate. And perhaps people may also wish to refer to my small book, which the moderator mentioned at the beginning. That is Engendering Good Governance, the Perspective of the Sokoto Jihad Leaders. That is one. And then there is Social Justice and Leadership Responsibility in Islam, a primer on good governance, which is a bigger one. But before I end, let me make these quick recommendations. Because of the point I made earlier that leadership crisis has become endemic in our own society, I wish to recommend that first, we Muslim community in Nigeria especially, we need to institute what we may call catching them young. We need to institute a purposeful leadership training, scheme for our younger ones. Especially, we can develop modules on leadership from these books of the Sokoto Jihad leaders. Let us develop some very simple manuals on leadership, which we should be teaching in our Islamia schools to catch them young, because of what I said earlier, that in Muslim organizations, in Muslim societies, there is crisis of leadership. You can see real incompetence in leadership, ineptitude and naivety in leadership. And you can also see selfishness and greed in leadership, and even fraud, unfortunately, even in Islamic organizations. So we need to institute purposeful and conscientious, leadership training to younger ones in order to catch them young. It's very important. And there are a lot of, nusus of the Quran and Hadith, and also from sayings of many scholars on the need to instill values to younger ones. We have to do this very seriously as a very necessary long-term plan in order to arrest the crisis of leadership in our society. Recommendation number 2. This may be considered by the Sultanate Council, we can advance this to the Sultanate Council. Sultan Foundation also may take this as a challenge, that we need to institute Leadership Training Institute. Let us establish Leadership Training Institute by the Sokoto Sultanate Council, or by the Sultan Foundation, or by Usman Danfodio University, or by Bayero University, Kano. Let us institute some Leadership Training Institute in which the leadership values as taught by these Sokoto Jihad leaders should be the manuals or the modules that should be, we should be training people, so that we can be organizing leadership training programs for all categories of people in the society, for newly elected officials at the local government level, or at the state level, or even at the national level, for governors, for parliamentarians, and all sort of. If you go close to some of these politicians and you have a discussion with them, you will find that some of them are terribly ignorant about leadership and the essence of leadership and the values of leadership. So we need to take it serious, the need to organize leadership training. Islamic organizations can also be part of the trainees, leaders of Islamic organizations. But then Islamic organizations also, like the MSS is doing. MSS is doing well in this regard. The Muslim Student Society of Nigeria, they have leadership training program. All other Muslim organizations should have leadership training programs. And some of the books written by the Sokoto Jihad leaders in some leadership training programs can be used either as a form of training manual or as a form of ta'alim manual, ta'alim bain al-maghrib wal-isha, or ba'da subwi, in a camping program, so that young people, Muslim youth, will be taught about leadership, will imbibe these leadership values, and so on and so forth. These are some of the few recommendations I can make. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. The comment made by Professor Rashid Abdul Ghani, I think those our lecturers in the departments of Islamic Studies and also NATAIS, Nigerian Association of Teachers of Arabic and Islamic Studies, should stand up to work together to insist on the need to include the Sokoto Caliphate intellectual legacy in whatever form in the syllabus of Islamic studies. But again, one other important thing is that I would like to recommend, I missed this in my recommendations, I would like to recommend to Islamic universities. We have Islamic universities now coming up here and there. I would like to recommend to them that it will be important to include the history of Sokoto Caliphate in their general study programs. Every university has its own general paper, general studies. So, like here in Bayero University, for example, there is Foundation of Nigerian Culture. Under that course, we can put the history of Sokoto Caliphate in that course. But Islamic universities that are coming up, they should try to institute a general course on Sokoto Caliphate so that every student, whether he offers or she offers Islamic studies or not, must know something about the Sokoto Caliphate. It is so pathetic that our younger ones do not know our history. You will be surprised that a lady I met who is from Kaduna State, who graduated from Bayero University in 2005, that means, and she was born in 1982 in Kaduna. That was 5 years before the creation of Kaduna State. But she even came to the university and graduated from the university, but she didn't know that Katsina State was created out of Kaduna State. She didn't know that Katsina State was part of Kaduna State. This is as worse as it is. Even closest of happenings to us, our younger ones do not know. Not to talk of history of over 200 years ago. So I think we should take this matter very seriously. And Islamic studies lecturers in this regard are really particularly challenged. The next was the person who asked a question about how would we in the Muslim society imbibe these leadership values. I think this lecture and some of the recommendations I made are part of the ways in which we can inculcate these leadership values in people, and especially in younger ones, especially the youth that are coming up. Like I said, Islamic organizations should have programs on leadership training because of the importance of leadership. People are just usually assigned leadership positions while they know next to nothing about leadership. So we need to, as much as possible, double up our efforts in trying to organize and institute leadership training schemes. Now, about the question that was asked by Imam Said, I think there is the teachings, some of the teachings, generally the teachings of the Shehu, the Sokoto Caliphate triumvirates, if a person consciously studies their books and their writings, you will see that they are not given to extremism in any way, and they are also not given to sectarianism, that is ta'assub, at-ta'assub ماذا تقول الطائفي, and so on and so forth. And they have written in some of their books, it's no time to give another lecture, but they have written in several of their books about avoiding, extreme behaviors in almost everything, and especially in issues of Aqidah, in issues of relating with the mazahibs and so on and so forth. They have written on that. I think if we study some of these books that were written by them on these issues, that will help us. But the most important thing is for a Muslim, whether he is a preacher or teacher, the most important thing is for a person to actually try to make sure that one, takes a moderate position in whatever he does. Moderacy does not mean al-fart or ifrat. It does not mean extremism. It does not mean laxity. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله ولو آمن أهل الكتاب لكان خيرا لهم منهم المؤمنون وأكثرهم الفاسقون لن يضروكم إلا أذى وإن يقاتلوكم يولوكم الأدبار ثم لا ينصرون